Well, hello everyone. My name is Brian Murnion, and I'm the executive director of the Mint Film Festival. Thank you for joining us with this virtual conversation today. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Tito's Handmade Vodka, and our major sponsor, Kibler and Kirch. Today we are joined with John Carter, the director of the Cowboy Hat movie. Welcome, John. Thank you for joining us.
I'll tip my hat, Brian. Thanks for having me.
I should have worn mine. I left it at home. So, John, tell us a little bit about your film, this feature-length documentary about the origins of the cowboy hat.
Yeah, it's both a historical overview, kind of the origins and how something that's kind of an everyday object became iconic, and how it sort of originated from one man's dream and vision, and how it sort of became this ubiquitous kind of symbol of America and the West and the ideals of the West and cowboy. And we kind of cover all that. We also cover the idea that the hat is very much still relevant. It's kind of had a very fantastic kind of renaissance in recent years, being adopted by hipsters and every female wearers. It's not just a symbol of the old-fashioned kind of John Wayne ideal anymore. It's something that's kind of universal and ubiquitous, and something I think that's very, very relevant in the current atmosphere that we live in. And we try to sort of cover that scope from both a historical context and also a kind of cultural context of where it started and where it is now.
And in your letter to us, you mentioned that you had some experience with a custom hat maker here in Billings. Did that inspire this film in any way?
It really was the seed that kind of started the whole thing. I had the good fortune of meeting a local businessman in Billings, Montana, named Rich Rand, and Rand Custom Hatters, which is very much an institution in Billings. And Rich was, to me, just a fascinating character, and probably deserves his own feature-length documentary. Just kind of cover his kind of career and his path. He started his business in the 1970s in Montana there, and has obviously done very well and become kind of one of the more synonymous kind of personalities that sort of is synonymous with cowboy hats in terms of keeping that kind of ideal alive. And Rich is a craftsman of the highest order. And I had the pleasure of meeting Rich probably about 8 years ago, and I did a small little sort of feature as part of another television show we were doing at the time, and just sort of became fascinated with this idea that just being so committed to one, just creating the ideal version of one thing, a utilitarian thing like a cowboy hat, but just doing it hundreds of thousands of times, which Rich has done since the 1970s. And that kind of, germination sort of led to this idea of, okay, well, why are we still fascinated with the cowboy hat? Why are we still, wearing it some 150 years after its inception? And why is it still relevant? Why is it still so meaningful to us? And that was really the germination. So the whole dream really honestly started at Billings, and it just kind of stuck with me for years and years and years. I kept saying, I want to do something with this. I want to do something with this. And finally, a couple of years ago, I started doing it.
John, when do you, with this particular film and the historic nature of this object, when do you know that your story, or when did you know that your story was ready to be filmed?
That's a really great question. It's one of those things in terms of evolution. I kept questioning. I've done a lot of short factual documentary, kind of shorts, as part of kind of my whole career for better part of 25 plus years, and the idea of taking something so singular and trying to blow it out to something that's feature length was definitely something I questioned for a long time. But honestly, I started not only sort of being on the precipice of wanting to pull that trigger myself, but also talking to my collaborators and going, I think this thing can sustain. I think I've got enough of the story here to sort of sustain a feature-length presentation. What do you think about the idea? And I think in our world where I do a lot of television, I do a lot of sports. It's kind of my background, and I do a lot of reality television, unscripted. But the idea of like getting into this documentary world with something like this was something that germinated for a long, long time. But probably about 2.5, 3 years ago, I started really, really questioning whether or not it could sustain itself for a feature-length kind of presentation. I kept reinforcing that answer as yes, it absolutely can. And when you talk about both the history, the cultural context, this film is also very much kind of a kiss to Hollywood in terms of what the Western genre did, how Westerns were really the first genre category. Hollywood was kind of built on sort of the foundation of Westerns, starting with the Great Train Robbery, and even we touch this in the film, going back to the contextual idea that Edison, who more or less funded and produced the Great Train Robbery, was also responsible for kind of creating Buffalo Bill's celebrity, bringing him out to the nation in terms of motion pictures. So the idea of all that stuff coming together and really creating this kind of iconic article in both the idea of the cowboy, but his enduring legacy, the cowboy hat. I think, solidly 2 years ago, I said, let's do it. And the rest of the collaborative team that I work with said, yeah, it's a good idea. Let's do it. And we devoted more or less the better part of 2 years around other projects in order to get it done. And many thanks to my team, the guys that work with me day to day, doing something that was a little bit outside of our comfort zone, but something we really wanted to do, and took a labor of love and really worked hard on it for a couple of years to get it done.
John, is the movie simply a celebration of the cowboy hat, or is the hat a more complex character?
Yeah. One thing that we really try to do is build a narrative structure, not just sort of a sequence of shots of hats that sort of is just more or less pretty pictures or some sort of just love fest for the cowboy hat, but really a narrative arc. There's a spine. There's kind of a progression. There's birth. There's actually death. Believe it or not, in a couple different hits. So we really, I really wanted to build a narrative arc around it. And that's almost going back to your previous question. That's sort of when I was convinced that we can make a feature-length documentary about something as simple as a cowboy hat, because there was so much great narrative kind of arc, peaks and valleys and highs and lows all the way through the storyline. And we've at least tried to do a good job of dotting the whole narrative structure with both setups and payoffs that sort of tell a very, very linear but traditional story narratively, not only about the cowboy hat, but a lot of characters that had a lot to do with the reason that we're still infatuated with this American symbol.
Yeah, I could feel that in the film, and I think it's evident of that complexity as well. John, what were some surprises? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that's really rewarding, because it is interesting to take something as simplistic as that and try to really build, a 3-act structure, or and something that has a narrative spine, just like you would in a scripted program, and have somebody look at it and say, okay, I kind of get that you've got setup, payoff. So yeah, that was a big part of the reason we can justify doing a feature-length film about the cowboy hat.
Yeah, so I guess a follow-up question is, a lot of documentaries are just very human-centric, and what challenges did you face as you're making this film about an object, a very basic object, without that human element just already present?
Yeah, there was a couple of things. One of the more fundamental obstacles is just telling the story of John B. Stetson. There's a lot of mythology around Stetson that is probably kind of corporate marketing in its origins, and sort of discerning kind of what Stetson has built as their kind of mythology from the standpoint of the company trying to market their product. And reality is hard to say because the whole thing started in the wilderness in the American West in the 1860s, more or less. So there's not obviously a lot of historical support material, both visually and even historically. So there's a lot of legend around it. So one of the more fundamental obstacles is really sort of trying to tell that story as factually as you can, and give it that sort of backbone that it really needs to sort of talk about how this object sort of came to be in the first place. But not only that, it's so practical that it gained this kind of universal acceptance and immediate popularity, and sort of telling that without a lot of historical photos, a lot of historical documents, and obviously anybody to narrate that from a historical perspective that was around at that time is a little bit of a fundamental challenge. I think more, a little more esoterically, a little bit more on the cerebral side, is sort of trying to figure out, as a filmmaker, trying to figure out how to sort of begin and have a good solid middle section and then have an ending to something that's inanimate, like a cowboy hat, and really put that sort of human element into the storyline. And that's one of the things I think I'm the most proud of, that there's 1,000 different stories about hat makers and different people that have obviously influenced the reason why we still love cowboy hats. And there's a lot of them that are recent history. And I think we do our best to kind of bring that whole story around from a story that began with vaqueros, well over 200 years ago, but still has a relevancy today and has had a resurgence today in terms of popular culture. I think that was one of the more rewarding elements to sort of figure out those lines that tie those two stories together, and how the earliest cowboys, the vaqueros that were working in Texas and South America, Central and South America, had a big influence on what John B. Stetson did, and Stetson sort of took it and molded it, and then tying that to current cultural ties, and the reason it's had a resurgence and has become universally accepted, I think, is one of the more rewarding aspects. So not so much a challenge, but once we kind of figured out a way to string that all together, that sort of tied the whole piece up, and we knew we had to film at that point.
As you were going through the interview process, did you come across, I guess purists who would say that the cowboy hat should only be for those who work in agriculture, or, are cowboys or cowgirls on ranches and that type of lifestyle?
Yeah, what's incredible is not at all. Even the people that sort of live and die by the hat, people that have based their whole, economic, future on betting on the hat. Manufacturers that are very traditional in Texas, and even Rich in Billings. I think one of the things that is absolutely common throughout that whole sort of process of doing interviews and talking to as many people as you can, both in relationship to Hollywood and in relationship to manufacturing custom hats today. None of those people look at this as an exclusionary symbol. We want as many people to embrace it. It symbolizes something, but it doesn't symbolize anything other than the spirit of American independence, the idealistic, sort of origins of the cowboy, but there's no exclusionary aspect to it at all. And that's to a man. There's not one person. We talked to presidential historians from LBJ's presidential library and his ranch, and custom hat makers of the day. And that's what's, I think, one of the more uplifting kind of aspects of the story, especially in the times that we're currently living in, is that there is a universal kind of willingness to share that symbol, from these people that have been making hats for generations, and guys that have been in this business for well over 40 years, and there's to a man and a woman. There's no exclusionary aspect of any aspect that we talked about, and that's, I think, a positive thing. I think you could probably look back historically at this thing and say, well, it's something that may seem exclusionary, but thank goodness, I think people like Pharrell Williams and current people that are influencers and have a bent on pop culture these days and have some level of leverage are embracing it and saying, okay, we want this as well, and that's part of the story.
John, did you grow up riding horses or around cowboy culture at all?
A little bit. So I didn't grow up in the West. I currently live in Colorado and love the Western lifestyle. I grew up in Mississippi, and yes, I had a horse, and sort of more or less, had that kind of farm, a background, especially at a very early age. I lived in a rural area. My grandparents were farmers, and had those kind of things. But not to the degree that I could not be called a horseman by any stretch of the imagination. I'm very much a fan of movies, and my probably affinity for Western apparel and Western lifestyle is that kind of mythological ideal that came out of Hollywood as much as anything. I do wear this, and I'm not wearing this as a prop. I've been on set all day in a very outdoor, windy, sunny, hot setting here in Arizona, where I'm currently filming a television show, and it's a very practical tool, and it's something I've adopted and really like and love to talk about. But it's a very utilitarian tool, and I embrace it now for a couple different reasons. One is utilitarian purposes, but my affinity for the Western apparel and the lifestyle kind of idea really probably is more influenced by Hollywood than anything else.
Do you have a favorite Western that you always just go back to?
Oh yeah. There's a long list, but The Searchers is still number one on my list, and I think that's kind of anybody that's in the film side of the world, or anybody that sort of tells story in the visual medium probably has an affinity for The Searchers like I do. And I think a big part of the film that I really enjoy doing, and hopefully strikes a resonant chord with people that are fans of films, is this kind of idea that we sort of tell a pretty complete story of kind of the origins of the Western and where it began, and going back as far as the Thomas Edison kinetoscopes and Buffalo Bill, but really talking about how John Ford had such a major influence on the Western as a genre, and probably is the undisputed master of that. And you can sort of start that conversation with Stagecoach, and you can end it with The Searchers. And I think it's a great contextual kind of starting point and stopping point in terms of talking about where the Western, at least in genre terms, kind of began and more or less pinnacled or peaked with The Searchers. So The Searchers hit me pretty strongly as far back as school, and has sort of stuck with me. And it's one of those films that I watch multiple times a year and still get just as much enjoyment out of it as I did probably the first time I saw it, as well as always picking up more nuance and more subtlety that both John Ford and John Wayne had in terms of their collaboration throughout that run that sort of began with Stagecoach and obviously continued after The Searchers, but I think really sort of reached its zenith with The Searchers.
Do you think you would ever step over and direct a Western narrative in any way?
I really would love to. Yeah, there's maybe some opportunity. I've had kind of a very circuitous route to where I am at this point. I did a lot of advertising, did a lot of sports television, some Olympic, and the Tour de France is kind of my big sports thing. I ran the production that brought the first live coverage of the Tour de France to the U.S. and the whole sort of pinnacle of Lance Armstrong and that kind of era, dated or not, but that was kind of my sort of thing. And in the last decade, I've transitioned more into unscripted and more on the entertainment side, and very much on the horizon, hopefully, is some venture at some point into scripted. And obviously, my affinity and love affair with the westerns would be. I'd love to obviously take a stab at taking a little bit of an update, to the genre and sort of seeing, where the genre can lead us in these current times and in the modern context. I think as we've seen multiple times, between Unforgiven and True Grit and these revival efforts to bring back the Western successfully, I think it's obviously, well proven that the genre still has some merit and some life left in it. And I would obviously love to be a contributor to that at some point.
Yeah. I would love to see what you would do behind a narrative project. I think that would be really interesting to see.
I appreciate that. Yeah. Hopefully, there's obviously some words on pages and things like that. We'll hopefully at some point get a venue to be seen at some point. I'd love to go spot, but I appreciate that, Brian.
John, do you have any advice for any first-time documentarian directors out there who are thinking about taking that leap and creating their first either short or long form documentary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would encourage anybody. I think it's obviously, great filmmakers have kind of emphasized this over the year, and I'll reinforce it, is that we're living in this incredibly fantastic time in terms of the technology being readily available in terms of capturing. Meaning, I started my career in exposing negative for advertising and even some feature work, short form feature work and things like that. So the ability to capture things digitally, the quality of gear, not having to have 12-person crews just to get the camera set up is a great boon, I think, to documentarians. And I think the biggest advice is to utilize that technology to tell a story that you're passionate about. And I'm also a big advocate of not necessarily taking on, one reason that my first feature-length documentary is about the Cowboy Hat is because it's a very kind of obtainable goal to tell a story about something it's not so heavy. It's obviously lighter fare. It doesn't have any incredibly unbelievable, impactful kind of assets to it from the standpoint that we're talking about a living person so much and anything that's controversial or needs to be brought to light. It's really just the endeavor to try to tell the story that I was passionate about, and that's kind of what I would encourage anybody that's sort of interested in getting into any kind of level of filmmaking, short form, long form, anything else. The idea is take a subject matter you're passionate about and you feel like you can tell a complete story with the beginning, middle, and end, and just do it. Doesn't matter obviously so much if you shoot on your iPhone. The audio is great. The cameras are great now in terms of every sort of packaging. So just tell your story and learn how to tell a story. I think I've had the benefit of a long career. I've never done anything else. I've been doing this more or less since right around 1989 or 1990 professionally. So it's been a long run, and I think I'm a beneficiary of really trying to just dive in and just try stuff and do things. And when I had free time over the last 2 years, we filmed a feature-length documentary and edited a feature-length documentary. And regardless of how well it turned out, it was a passion project and something very proud of in terms of just getting to the finish line with. And I think that's the biggest thing for young filmmakers to overcome that kind of fear level barrier or anything that you perceive as an obstacle, and just tackle a subject that you're passionate about, and don't worry too much about how long it turns out. You don't need to create a feature-length film your first time out of the gate. You can tell a great story in a matter of minutes, and that's sort of the building blocks that I've gone through over the years of telling short-form stories, and then really finally getting the confidence and the ability, I think, both from a resource standpoint, but also more importantly, experience-wise, to sort of feel like I could dive into something that's long form.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really great to hear. Are you an avid Tour de France watcher?
I am. Unfortunately, I'm actually getting back to work now that the postponed Tour de France is actually underway.
Right.
And I'll be honest with you, I produced the Tour de France for 6 years, and was obviously immersed in it, up to my eyeballs, to the point where I probably was still having those, we have these dreams about, not being prepared for a test, or whatever. We all have a common dream. I was still having dreams about not being ready for that day's production of live feed for the Tour de France, probably up until 3 or 4 years ago, even well over a decade after I stopped doing it. So it's one of those things that sticks with you, and will always be a part of who I am. I just don't quite avidly follow it as much anymore. And I'll be honest with you, I was a little heartbroken by kind of the aftermath of when I got more or less out of the sport. I stayed in the sport for a few years. After even doing the Tour de France, produced the Tour of California and some other stuff. But I think I invested so much in it that all the doping scandals and some of the stuff that we sort of set up for the public to consume in terms of storytelling, and this obviously incredible story about Lance Armstrong, and even after Lance with Floyd Landis, and kind of more or less the whole thing kind of unraveling a bit, left me a little bit heartbroken about the whole process, and so much investment in terms of what I had put into it in terms of putting it out there to the public. But I still like it. I think the sport is at least seemingly kind of cleaned itself up. It's to me, it's one of the great sports. It's one of those things that I will always love and look back with a lot of fondness in terms of being able to cover something that I felt passionately about, and I still love it. But I probably don't follow it as close as I should or used to, for sure. Yeah. I certainly don't know who's even in the yellow jersey today. I think we're at something like stage 9, 10, or 11, somewhere around that as we record this, and I have no idea who's wearing a yellow jersey, and that's freeing in some ways, but I'm also doing about 10, 11 hours a day on set at the current moment, under kind of taxing circumstances, trying to be safe and mask up and keep everybody at safe distances and be very diligent, and that's a challenge in and of itself. So I haven't been able to keep up, but I'm still friends and keep in contact with people like Phil Liggett and Bob Roll, who are the commentators on the show, and obviously we exchanged pleasantries at the beginning of it. I wish those guys luck, because it's one of the hardest jobs in sports, to be honest with you, to do 20, 23 straight days, even though there's a couple of days off. But you're on the air 23 straight days on very, very long days, and it's harder than the Olympics, I can tell you from personal experience, to cover just by the grind itself. But sports is still got its place in my heart, for sure.
So if you could survive covering the Tour de France, then spending 10 days in the Arizona sun should be,
It's a cakewalk. Yeah. If I compare, it is relatively easy. I think it's one of those things that you definitely appreciate when things are a little bit easier. So I've still got guys that used to work for me working on the show and now producing the show, guys that hopefully I helped kind of bring along and mentor a little bit and advance their career. And those guys are running the show now, and they're doing a very, very good job at it. Probably a better job than I did, as we all learned together. But those guys are doing a great job, and the coverage is in very capable hands, for sure.
Well, John, I really appreciate your time and for sharing your thoughts with us today. And if you're watching this and haven't seen the film, please be sure to check out the Cowboy Hat movie. It's available until October 10th here on our Mint virtual platform. John, anything you want to add in closing?
Just thanks to the Montana International Film Festival, you guys, Brian. We're very honored. We just have gotten the film out to the world, and you guys are early adopters in terms of getting us in the festival. We're in the early days yet in terms of our submission kind of process, and obviously this kind of very complex and interesting world of virtual festivals. We obviously wish we could be there to screen it in person and get some audience reaction beyond our little test screenings and some of the stuff we've done locally here. But thanks for including us. I think it's obviously It's got its origin. This film has its origins in Billings, so it's very appropriate that it screened at Mint. And we wish you guys the best. And hopefully next year we'll do something in person together.
Yeah, we look forward to it. I hope so too. All right.
Bet.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.